All right, what is going on, Sales Dev Squad? Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the Sales Dev Squad podcast. We have one of my good buddies on the podcast today. I've been meaning to get him on here for quite some time, and super excited to have him on here and chat a lot of really SDR focused stuff for any SDR that is really passionate about becoming an AE and sort of what it takes to get there, and what the real expectations of an SDR really are. Billy's going to be able to shed some light into that topic for us today. But Billy, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast today, man.
Mateo, it's great to be here, man. I've been trying to get on this thing for a while now, so glad you finally allowed me.
Absolutely, dude. But yeah, Billy and I, we actually worked together briefly over at ServiceTitan. ServiceTitan is a unicorn software company. They provide sales tools for residential home service contractors, and they've been blowing up here in the San Fernando Valley specifically. What I believe is the number one, the largest SaaS company here in Los Angeles, and they're doing a lot of awesome stuff. Billy's on the sales strategy and operations side of things. So Billy, let's just hop into it here, man. Give us the real juice on the SDR role if you want to share a little bit more about your background and I guess how you got into sales.
Yeah, sure. The real juice on the SDR role. So I guess we should start with me as a guy who had no juice when I was an SDR. So I graduated college in 2011, and like so many, I'm sure out there, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And if you're the outspoken or largely verbal type, a lot of people will tell you go into sales. So without really any research or any knowledge on it, I did, and started out in recruiting. And then I got into full cycle sales from there. Came to ServiceTitan about 3 years ago as an account executive, and been in sales strategy and operations for the last two.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for that overview for our viewers here. Definitely really appreciate it. I guess what we wanted to talk a little bit more about today is, obviously the SDR is a really challenging role, but kind of dive deeper into like, what metrics leaders should be focusing on their SDRs. In your opinion, there's a divide between like vanity metrics, so to speak, as well as, metrics that you believe tend to really capture performance even long term for an SDR. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on, what are some metrics that SaaS companies or sales organizations should really be focusing on in terms of like SDR teams specifically?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to metrics, like anybody who gives me an ear to talk into will hear me speak constantly about the divide between a vanity metric and an actual metric that matters. And, you know, the most important thing, what's key with an SDR when you think about what an SDR's job is, brand awareness, calling, plugging away, getting people on the phone, getting yeses, getting nos. The whole idea is you can't forget that an SDR is a sales development representative. They're a seller. And so when you think about the metrics that an SDR should be based off of, you can't make it about absent activity. You have to consider a seller, or an SDR rather, as a seller who is ultimately a part of driving revenue. So when I look at metrics for any seller, you have to think at the end of the day, does it draw a straight line to company revenue? If it does, then it's a metric that matters. If it's not, it's a vanity metric. And one of the things that I absolutely hate when companies do this, and this happened to me when I first started out cold calling, was you're given a number. You must make this many dials a day, 80, 100, 1,000, whatever it is. And you must make this many email impressions because some untested cadence was that decision maker in how many of these you should do. I hate those metrics. Like, I know I told you this when you were an SDR, and I'll tell any SDR that I come across, like, you can make 1,000,000 dials in a day, but if you don't move a single account forward to a point where you can actually tangibly set them up to become a partner of your company, it doesn't matter. So emails, phone call blasts, to me, those are vanity metrics. Those are stupid metrics. Another one I really don't like in the SaaS world for an SDR is booked meetings. booked meetings when you consider just the act, or worse, when you compensate the act of booking a meeting, compensate the act of, let me get as many of these on here as I can and let me not worry at all about what the quality of this meeting looks like, because I know I'll get $25 or whatever just for getting this on an AE's calendar. It's a terrible metric. And if you have any sort of a stringent ideal customer profile where you do have to qualify and disqualify, immediately it becomes a crap metric. So when I think about what matters for an SDR, you got to start thinking about what makes the cash register ring. And more importantly than when you actually book a meeting is, what percentage of your meetings stick? Who shows up to the phone? Who's excited to get on the call? Who did you really get enthused on the front end of that call? And based on that, how many of those meetings then qualify and get flipped into an AE's pipeline where we really have a chance of selling this thing? Those are much better indicators that are actually incredibly easy to compute. You don't need a CRM dashboard, or you don't really need anything other than your iPhone calculator to figure it out, and real quick. The other one I love that talked about on Gideon Thomas's podcast for Deal Hub about metrics that matter was this idea of a pipe seat close rate. How many licenses or how many seats does Billy the SDR get flipped into Mateo the AE's pipeline that he then closes? Because then I can tangibly say this many dials or this many emails or this many meetings resulted in this many dollars based on those licenses. And when I think about an SDR, like, it is an incredibly hard position. It is the hardest individual contributor position in sales. Who's going to take that next step, or who's going to either stay an SDR for a while or become a customer support agent for a different tech company?
Thanks, man. That's a lot of great information there. And it seems like the metrics that are placed in a lot of sales organizations or software organizations are really what drives the sort of mindset of each individual sales rep. For example, if you're compensated on meetings, you're, like you mentioned, just solely focused on getting meetings because that's what you're compensated for and that's what you're graded on. So it seems like this idea of like having metrics that are actually tied to, like you said, revenue is super important. Like, how can sales leaders that are just measuring sort of just booked meetings and dials as their sole metrics, how can we change their mindset, or what specific metrics should we be, having in place at the SDR level to incentivize nothing but revenue? And I guess, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it does. And let's unpack that in a few different ways. So think about a lot of SaaS leaders, right? Like, more times than not, you either get this absolutely brilliant salesperson who comes up with an idea for some sort of software, some sort of service they can sell, or maybe they're an engineer who just is a brilliant coder and comes up with that next great solution. There's also option 3, which is just a complete nincompoop who's sick of working for somebody else, doesn't have a good business plan, doesn't have a good business structure for the way they do things. How many times have you seen it in the tech world where that's actually an incredibly young individual who, whether they're at the highest level of brilliance or at the lowest, isn't necessarily experienced with how to build a company from every different direction? So what do? You start reading sales books. A lot of sales books, and a lot of people that write them, older generations that aren't in the TikTok sales world or aren't in the LinkedIn quick hits. So they'll tell you, you build a sale, you get your brand out there by hitting as many voicemails as you can, by being told as many times over the phone that this is not the best way to do it. And somehow, some way, that'll cement this mindset that activity equals dollars. But we know in this world, like, we're past working hard. We're into smarter ways to do it. We know that people are far more interested on most levels than who the actual person selling is than what the product actually is, because in most cases, there's a lot of competition. So when a sales leader tries to justify this idea that you got to hit 80 dials a day, I don't know what they're talking about. I'll tell you what, my first full cycle sales job, I had to make 100 dials a day. And not only that, I was the sole seller. The old VP of sales, he was leaving, and he had left for a period of time while I was there. So I was the only person on the phones. And a demo of the software was an hour, which means every day I had a demo, that's one less hour I can actually prospect. I could actually call out. And I mean, I'll tell you, I was so green. I had no idea how to set up a cadence. I didn't know like who I was really trying to reach out to. But for a leader of an organization to tell that seller, even if you make 100, or even if you have 3 demos in a day, you still got to make 100 calls. Like, that's how you burn people out. Eventually, they're going to lose sight of your vision as a leader. So there is no silver bullet, and 100 sales leaders could listen to this, and some of them are going to agree with me and some of them aren't, and that's okay. But the ones who are thinking about the sales development representative as a conduit to the company making money are the ones who are going to hit their goal more. They're the ones who are going to align sales development goals with account executive goals. They're the ones whose boards are going to be happy every month. And they're ultimately the ones that are going to hit that gong or ring that bell or whatever they do far more frequently, because everybody's on board with the vision.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome, man. I know we talked yesterday more about like some of the best SDRs are more than just appointment setters. They're always looking at the big picture. And you mentioned this idea of like pre-closing yesterday. Could you touch more upon like how or what you've noticed as far as SDRs that look beyond just that meeting that they set and really partnering with their AE to bring in that new business?
Absolutely. So can I start with a great example of pre-closing, by the way?
Please, go ahead.
You remember the last time you and I hung out in person?
Shoot, man, it's been a while. But refresh my memory, please.
All right. Well, to the listener, the last time you and I hung out, it was in a divey spot in NoHo. And we were eating this meal, this absolutely great meal. And, the server kept bringing out Modelo's that I don't remember ordering. But
that's right, the Indian restaurant.
You posed me a question, and like it has plagued me for the last 6 months, because look how much the world has changed just from December of 2019 to whatever year it is in 2020. But you asked me, and I'll never forget this, what is the future of SaaS? And I swear I needed to clean up on aisle 5 in my brain after that, because I could not for the life of me give you a valid answer and say like definitively this is what the future looks like. But for 6 months, all I did was think about that, so that, when you finally reached out to me to get on this podcast, I thought about it and I thought about it, and I still don't have a good answer, but I'm still excited for the meeting. Like, to me, that was a great pre-close, because you had me wanting more. You got me to the next level of communication. So the idea of pre-closing, it goes like this. Like, this is something I learned as a recruiter, and, recruiting was a skill that was a job that taught me a lot of sales skills that I didn't realize at the time when I was a recruiter were so valuable, but you learn over time. But this concept of pre-closing, you've got to get these little micro commitments along your deal map that leave a prospective buyer wanting to advance down that path. Because sales is not, it's not like an A to B to C to D thing. It's a choose your own adventure, because the buyer ultimately pulls the strings. And the notion of pre-closing is that the best SDRs that do it set expectations properly. And they let you know, like, hey, I'm not just an appointment setter. I'm here as the first part of a sequence of things that is going to help you see what solutions are out there that could help you with your business. And so great pre-closing is the sales development rep that stays on the phone and makes sure that I've vocalized certainly 3 takeaways I want to get from a demo. They're the ones that confirm that I received the calendar invite and clicked accept while I'm on the call with them. They're the ones that call me in the morning and make sure that at 2:00 on Thursday, I'm going to be on a demo. That's exceptional SDR work, and that's what pre-closing is all about. Because You are not just booking an appointment for your AE. The buck does not stop there. If anything goes backwards, you have to be the one that's able to revive that deal, which is why sales development is so difficult, because sales doesn't work in a straight line. It works in a perfect circle, and things can go backwards, they can go forwards. It gets very agile. And it's very important for any SDR out there that if you do want to become an account executive, or even if you want to become a sales development manager, you've got to master this idea of pre-closing. You have to create that cycle where everything works and it flows and it keeps moving forward.
Dude, I love that, man. It really is changing my perspective on the way we should train SDRs. And like you said, the more they can start thinking big picture, them moving into an AE role is in a complete new transition or new world, because they already kind of have an idea of how that handoff process works and what comes after that.
And there's growing pains to that too, right? So like the very best thing you can do as an SDR is learn how to start pre-closing along the way. And like, you close by getting those small commitments along the way. Jeb Blunt's one of my favorite sales authors, and he talks about this idea of gaining micro commitments at each step. It's the same principle, because for any SDR that's going to become an AE, one of the things that you're going to find that you're going to struggle with the most, if you look at a deal in 3 stages, you've got discovery, you've got your demo, and then you've got closing. SDRs who stay with one company are usually great at discovery. You know, they know how to talk to the prospective customer. They get the lingo. The demo, you can train to that, and it's really subjective of who's actually giving the demo. But for any SDR, the hardest part of the transition to the account executive role is most cultures and most SDRs just frankly don't have that closing experience, and it's not taught as part of the destination as an SDR, you know, at scale in most cases. So learning that pre-closing and understanding that you're more than just a meeting setter, like you are part of that discovery process, you are part of that demo process based on the things you learn. You're their best friend for 5 minutes until you pass them off to an account executive. It goes way beyond that, because if you know how to master that one skill, then when you do become an account executive, it slightly kind of changes that learning curve in such a way where you don't have to, you know, start from zero on learning how to close deals.
Exactly, man. I love that. I wanted to shift gears here a bit. I loved your example yesterday when we were talking about like ICP, how most businesses have pretty strict ICPs, except for like you had a great example, like a restaurant, right? Like a restaurant's ICP is pretty loose. Anyone who's hungry, anyone who's nearby, and as long as the restaurant's open, you know, any potential buyer. And so this idea of like better understanding your ICP and knowing when and why to DQ or disqualify a potential lead is a super beneficial skill to have. Could you, I guess, elaborate a bit more on that idea?
Sure. So I used to sell financial software, and I have a book rack still full of like stock market 101 and like economics 101 books that I read in order to start learning my buyer. So the example was like the easiest ICP in the world is the server at a restaurant who has somebody come and sit down and is handed a menu, because they're already hungry, they're already in your restaurant, they're already ready to eat, they're going to spend money. That is a little tougher these days, given how the restaurant industry is coping. But you know, when I think of ease, like that is what, you know, a hot lead, that's what a scorching marketing lead or a one call close looks like. There's someone just ready to say yes. But when you're learning your ICP, like one of the biggest skills and one of the hardest parts about being an SDR, to take a step back, is that for a lot of SDRs, you're early in your career. Some come right out of college, some have a job or two before they go into it, but you're finding out a lot about not only who you are, but what you want to be. And college certainly didn't give me all those answers. They give you all those answers?
Not at all.
So for a lot of SDRs, it's hard to be patient. It's hard to realize how difficult the world is. And part of that is like you have to do a lot of the grimy things as an SDR you don't want to do. you have to read books on your industry. You have to hear 50 people say no in 50 different ways so that you can gain that muscle memory to get a yes at some point. And when it comes down to ICP, like that is something that's definitely in your control, because every company that you go to is going to have somebody that can explain what the ideal customer profile looks like and how you can take it the next level so that you master it. And it's not something that's going to surprise you, that, you know, when you have those phone calls, somebody's tone may change or somebody might sneeze loudly, but you know exactly what you're going to ask and what answers you do or do not want to hear in that conversation.
Definitely, man. And I love how you alluded, like the SDR role is definitely not an easy one, and usually it's someone like myself who like first job out of college or transitioning careers, and like the first 1 to 2 years are definitely a grind. And you touched upon this idea of like setting career expectations. Like how should managers or sales leaders or hiring managers really set solid career expectations as it pertains to the SDR role specifically?
This one's tough, and I think that the problem here is that this lies a little bit differently within every organization. But let me kind of paint a holistic picture of what a sales organization looks like. And when you're an SDR and you come in, like, you know, we all see the Wolf of Wall Street, and we see Leonardo DiCaprio immediately having success on the phone as he passes off a lead to Matthew McConaughey. And we assume that that's just what sales is like. People want to buy things and people have things to sell to them, but it's not that easy. And what happens as an SDR is, like, you know, the best thing that can happen, if you ask me as an SDR, is you start off slow. Like your first 90 days, you barely survive, because you learn really fast what fight or flight looks like in a professional scenario. And then the best course of action is, like, you start gaining traction over time. For me, I think it took me about 4 months into recruiting to truly figure out how to read a project manager's resume before I could start having intelligent conversations. And when you're in that role, what you don't realize, and where I think a lot of SDRs lose sight, is a recruiter will tell them some arbitrary time scale, 6 months, 12 months, you'll become management or whatever.
Director of sales.
Exactly. That doesn't do you too much good when you're thinking about it. But you're figuring out your role, and the way you perceive your manager, they're the ones that get to have fun leading meetings, and like they lead your one-on-ones. You're like, man, it's like, I'm so good at this. I'd so much rather be doing this for somebody else. And what you don't see is, like, you're responsible for one number as an SDR. Your manager is responsible for 6 numbers, and they have a director of sales that is asking them, why is this, you know, seller not hitting that number? That director of sales, and your manager works 60, 70 hours a week. That's also a very hard job. They have a director that's working even more hours above them, who's answering to the VP of sales, who's answering to the CRO, who's answering to the board. And it's so on and so forth. And the difficult thing about management is, you know, you have to be the one to set the culture. How much is performance versus how much is coaching? And what I don't think enough SDRs truly know, in the guise of sharing memes on Slack and having the good and the bad conversations with their manager, is they're the ones that are figuring out, how can I, you know, help this one area of opportunity, or how can I further coach this one strength that this rep has? I've heard you on your cold calls. You got juice, man. Like, you've got good energy that I would want to absolutely coach too if I were your manager. But on the flip side of it too, like for reps that aren't doing well, like managers have to figure out a way to put together, you know, a PIP plan. And I've had plenty of those conversations with managers, because that is not an easy thing to do. They relate to you at a human level when they're managing you, and they know what's good and what's bad in your life and how things are going. There's a connection. worse than anything right now, you got COVID going on. And for anybody who's managing a team, like a lot of people are having to let go of good performers. And it's not because they want to, or it's not because they have a vendetta against you, which I thought plenty of times in my sales career that my manager did. But actually at the end of the day, like it's a tough job as a line manager, because you got to tell the one that's performing really well, that's done everything you've asked them to, that the company can't sustain to keep them on the payroll at this point. So it's a challenge, man. I mean, there's no
It's like a double-edged sword.
Right. There's no silver bullet to how do you put together like a perfect coaching culture.
It's tough, man. And I think it really comes down to really recruiting the best people for the job. And I know that you were a recruiter for a good chunk of your career, and I know that that taught you a lot about sales, but you learned a lot about recruiting as well. I was hoping you could share some tips for our viewers here, for anyone who's just looking to bounce back into an SDR role, or someone that's been inspired by this conversation here into taking their first SDR role. I guess, like, what recruiting tips do you have for them?
Well, first of all, if you don't have a good recruiter, like in your LinkedIn network, find one. And anybody here who's either in Los Angeles or Atlanta that's listening in on this pod, find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I'm happy to put you in touch with good people in both cities. The thing about a recruiter is, sellers, you ever feel commoditized when you're selling? Nobody feels more commoditized than a recruiter, because they are the only sellers in the world whose product can say no to a willing buyer. And it makes it doubly tough. I look back at recruiting, and I actually was having a conversation with my old boss the other day, who was my boss when I was recruiting. And I told him, like, I left that company hating every single one of you, because it was such a hard job, and like I got so much tough love while I was doing it. And in that time, I have gone back on LinkedIn and I've reconnected with every single one of them, because I can reflect on successes I've had since then that are a direct result of recruiting. It is a terribly difficult job. It is incredibly volatile during times like these. But at the same time, if you want to learn sales skills, try recruiting, even if just for 6 months, because you will learn how to manage time. You will learn how to cope with stress. You will learn how much coffee you can drink. You'll learn how many tabs you're going to have open. And that is like the perfect training wheel to get into an SDR role, right?
Dude, I love that. I always ask that question and I always get different responses, but this is the first time someone has said, hey, if you want to get into sales, try recruiting, dude. Great answer there.
I went to Sales Loft Rainmaker in 2016, and one of the first questions they asked when they were trying to figure out, like, what is the DNA of a good SDR, they said the people we love to interview the most are technical recruiters, because they are so comfortable being on the phone. They are so content with hearing the word no. Like, it's a pretty great training ground to figure out how far you want to take your sales career.
And I feel like the barrier to entry for an entry-level recruiting role might be a little bit easier than an entry-level sales role per se, no?
Yeah, I mean, so bad sample, but I'm from the South. Like, the only thing they really required when you did it was a bachelor's degree from like a public school, and that's not to discriminate against private schools. That just happens to be the firm I was at. And were you like in a fraternity or a sorority, or did you play a sport? Because those are generally the ones who have a good work ethic or don't have a good work ethic, but are really good on the phone and can socialize with people. So it's a low barrier to entry, but another critical lesson too that I learned as a recruiter, you learn how to never cash your paychecks until they actually get to you, because
That's true.
I had a month as a recruiter where I was going to make more money than I ever could have imagined when I was 24 or 25. And through clawbacks and people not taking jobs and this, that, the other thing, I lost every single dollar in the month of October 2014, and I'll never forget it ever.
That's rough, man. Good learning experience, though, no?
Absolutely, the best learning experience.
That's awesome, man. Well, Billy, this has been an exciting conversation, man. I think I've taken a lot from this. I know our viewers will hear. For anyone out there that just wants to pick your brain more, have you on their podcast, ask you some questions, where's the best place to reach you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, Billy Stein, easy. I'm connected with Mateo. I will surely pin this one to the top of my profile because I can't wait to see the playback of it.
This is going to be great.
But I'm really glad to help. And like one final thing I would tell anybody who's an SDR, I can't stress it enough that this is a extremely difficult time. And, I came out of college in 2011 at the end of the Great Recession. Like those times were tough. These times are tough. So whether it's to talk about this podcast, whether it's to get on a different podcast, if you want just to have a real conversation about like what's the outlook for an SDR, what the job market looks like, mock interview scenarios, whatever you want to do. If you mention that you saw me on here, I'm more than happy to spare time for you.
Thanks, Billy. Same goes here, guys, but Billy's definitely an awesome resource to have. He's a recruiter for several years, so he definitely knows how that works. But Billy, thanks so much for joining us today. Sales Zip Squad, hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and feel free to reach out to Billy if you guys have any further questions, and we will catch you guys on the next one.